Hello and welcome to this new episode of A Grand Tour with my Great Great Grandad. My name is Ed Hill. Now this is quite a momentous episode as it's the beginning of covering William's journey from the UK out to Mexico. So it's going to be labelled Series 2, Episode 40 to distinguish it from the previous 39 episodes about his journeys in Europe. And as I think I mentioned at the end of the last episode, the tone of this second part of the journal is a bit different in that it covers very much William's journeying across the Atlantic via the Caribbean to get to Veracruz in Mexico, and then his land journey from Veracruz to the centre of Mexico to Zacatecas, which is where he takes up his job involved with the mint in that city. This is obviously a lot more unfamiliar territory to William than Europe was. I think he had been to Europe before previously, so I think a lot of the sights and sounds he experiences on this journey are newer to him and perhaps much more surprising, I suppose, or unexpected. So just to say a few things, if you listen to the first part of the journey around Europe, I hope you'll enjoy this new chapter, as it were, journeying out to Mexico. And if you're binge listening, by all means do. You can listen to A Grand Tour with my Great Great Grandad on any available podcast platform which you choose. It's distributed to pretty well all of them. Now, William begins this bit of the journal with two interesting things. The first is that he writes a table of his journey in terms of places that he visits and distance from London and date at which he arrives at them. So, for example, he sails from Southampton, which is 75 miles from London, according to William's calculations. Then they travel by paddle steamer via Madeira. So they set off on the 2nd of October and they arrive at Madeira on the 9th of October, and that is 1,401 miles from London. And it goes on in this vein, so they get to Haiti on the 28th of October, and that is 4,871 miles from London. Jamaica, 5,126. Veracruz, 6,676 miles from London. And that carries on until December 27th, when they get to Zacatecas, which is 7,644 miles away from London. So he leaves on the 2nd of October, arrives in Zacatecas on the 27th of December. Basically, the journey takes him 86 days to get from London, which is his home, out to Zacatecas. So nearly 3 months. So it's a fair old time, even with the invention of steam power for the crossing. And the other thing that he does is he writes a kind of very brief introduction explaining a little bit about the journals as well. Slightly odd, you may think, why didn't he write this at the beginning of the first journal, which would have made more sense? But I suppose he's writing these when he's in Mexico, so certainly from his time in Europe, that had been quite a few years before. So it's a few years, but they're all being written at the time from his home in Mexico. So I think maybe he started doing the one, and then when he got to this one, sort of decided, well, I better say why I'm writing them, and that's why this little preface that he writes here is created. But before we start reading that bit, and then the actual beginning of his journey, and just to say, he begins travelling down from London via train to Southampton, where he gets on a paddle steamer to go out to Mexico. But before I begin that, I'll just say the usual things I say about making contact if you want to after listening to the podcast. There's the Twitter account, or X account, which is Scott of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour. It's the number 3G Grand Tour. I now have a Blue Sky account, which is at scottsgrandtour.bsky.social, and that's Ed Hill. So if you put in Ed Hill, hopefully you'll see at scottsgrandtour.bsky.social. There's a Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my Great Great Grandad. I'll say all these again at the end. So basically, if you Google a Grand Tour with my Great Great Grandad, you'll certainly see it on the various podcast platforms that are available, such as Acast, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, so forth, all those. And also the Facebook page tends to come up as well. So, those are good ways to make contact with me if you want to, and you can let me know maybe the mistakes I might be making regarding the history. Just to let you know, really the format will be exactly the same as it's been with this new journey, as it was with the old. I read from the journals, I stop intermittently to explain some of the things that William's talked about, or some of the things that he's referenced that then pique my interest, which I then research a bit more into and then talk about. And basically it goes on like that ad infinitum, really. Got me reading from the journals, me talking about the journals, me reading from the journals, and me talking about the journals. So that's how it goes. So as I say, this is really quite an exciting time for me. If you're enjoying the podcast, which I hope you are, it's nice to get any feedback at all regarding them. And I think in some ways, all this journal really is very, very interesting, because it's a really interesting time in terms of travel and the introduction of steam and how that affects people's journeying across water, not just across land, which I suppose you could say the previous journey through Europe was more concerned with. He's visiting interesting islands such as Haiti and Jamaica on his journey. And of course he gets to Mexico, which at that time was in a very interesting state. It had not so long before won its independence from Spain. And in fact, William is going out there being employed by the Anglo-Mexican Mint Company, and I have done a bit of research into that, and I will go into probably more detail about that in future podcasts. But just to paint a little bit of a picture, Mexico was, and still is, a great resource of precious metals, gold and silver in particular. And once it had won its independence from Spain, it was using these resources to attract foreign companies and foreign investment. And in some ways you could say those countries were exploiting Mexico, but in some ways it was helping Mexico to establish itself as a more independent country than it had been under the rule of Spain. And William is travelling out to Zacatecas to take over the mint there as part of this pretty widespread trend that was happening, particularly with British companies who saw Mexico as an opportunity to make money. And William, as a steam machinery engineer, was going out there to help set up the machinery that was being sold by British companies like Boulton and Watt, who were famous for many things in terms of steam innovation, but one of their key areas was making steam-powered machines that pressed coins and minted coins. And so William is very much part of this movement of British companies getting involved in Mexico, hoping to exploit its silver resources by doing deals with the Mexican government and sort of taking over their mints and supplying them with new machinery. And the idea was they all thought there'd be so much silver and gold there that they'd make loads of money doing it. Didn't necessarily always work out that way. And in fact, I've read a little bit that the deal that was done with the Anglo-Mexican Mint Company that William is part of wasn't very popular with the locals. It was seen as not a good deal, but I shall explain more about that in a later episode, I think, because in this first episode of the second series, we're very much concerned with William's travels by sea to Mexico. And as I mentioned before, it begins with this preface about why he's writing the journals. Should all the foregoing pages ever fall into the hands of a stranger, I would beg him to observe that they have been put together without any attempt at literacy composition, but for the purpose of amusing the members of my own family, and also of informing my children, when perhaps their parent may be no more, of the scenes they have traversed and the cities they have visited in his company, though too young to recollect them, and also to give my youngest daughter some slight insight into the land that gave her her birth. I have also had another reason for writing this. The rough notes that I had previously made of my journeyings on the continent of Europe were very incorrect. I have in these volumes endeavoured to correct that as far as in my power, though these pages will not be found free of the same complaint. And also during my residence here they have assisted me to pass the long winter evenings, and for the last few weeks that I have been confined to my own room with lameness, have afforded me much agreeable occupation. W. Scott, Zacatecas, Mexico, April 24th, 1844. Voyage to the West Indies and Mexico. On account of an engagement made with the Anglo-Mexican Mint Company, I left London on the evening of the first day of October 1843, and proceeded by the South Western Railway to Southampton, on arriving at which place I proceeded to the Castle Inn, and having partaken of some refreshment with some gentlemen that were to be my fellow voyagers, retired to rest. October 2nd. This morning on rising I was presented with one of those most beautiful views in England. The broad expanse of Southampton water, sleeping like a mirror in the bright sunlight. The green shores of the New Forest on the opposite side, verdant, and down to the very water's edge, the white houses of the villages and the spires of the churches peeping from amongst the trees. Then, on the bosom of the walls itself, lay 4 of those mighty steamships that proclaim mercantile greatness to the furthermost quarters of the globe. There was the 4th, the Medway, the D, belonging to the Royal Mail Company, and the Braganza, belonging to the Peninsular and Oriental Company. These were surrounded by a multitude of small craft, both French and English, trading to Havre, Bordeaux, Portsmouth, the Isle of Wight, and other places, sailing craft, yachts, and boats innumerable. The town of Southampton lays in a very pretty situation on the slope of a hill. It is the capital of the county of Hampshire and contains some very good public buildings, and a very handsome pier where the steamboats can land passengers on all states of the tide. They are also making some large commodious docks. As to antiquities, there is the ruin of the old castle, with one of the gates still standing, and it is a very interesting relic of former ages. Southampton was founded in 873, population of 22,600 persons. At 11 o'clock we went on board a small steamboat laying at the pier, and in the course of a quarter of an hour afterwards I found myself on board the 4th, Captain W. M. Chapman, a splendid vessel of 2,400 tons burthen and 450 horsepower. All was hurry, bustle, and confusion, passengers running hither and thither, seeking out their berths and luggage, etc. But, however, being a little acquainted with these matters by previous voyaging, I had taken care to see a plan of the vessel previous to leaving London, so that I had nothing to do when I arrived on board but go to the steward for my key, and then to my berth. There I turned in my luggage and put it to rights, then locked the door, placed myself behind a cigar, and proceeded to the deck to watch the busy scene before me, and amuse myself by watching my fellow passengers and the confusion a great many of them was finding themselves in on board a sea-going steamer for the first time. The mighty ship was surrounded by boats and smaller vessels containing provisions of every description, it being no small matter to victual all the ships containing more than 200 persons for a month. There was fresh chilled beef, mutton and pork, hampers of fowls, geese, turkeys and ducks, boxes of eggs, cases of rabbits, pigeons and game. These, on being hoisted on board, were immediately placed in ice in a large pit appropriated to the purpose. And then there was barrels of potatoes, turnips, carrots, and greens in immense quantities. The forward part of the spar, the upper deck, contained a large coop filled with the live fowls of ducks and geese, 50 sheep in pens, and the same number of pigs, whilst on the main deck, in her own little house and comfortably munching her hay, was a pretty Ayrshire cow who had already made 3 voyages across the Atlantic. By 3 o'clock the bustle had died away, and all eyes were turned to the shore, anxiously watching for the arrival of the mails from London. At 3:30 a small steamer left the pier, and the word was immediately given for all persons not going on the voyage to leave the ship. In a few minutes the mails were alongside under the care of Lieutenant Turner, M.N. They were quickly got on board, and precisely at 4 the captain mounted the paddle box and immediately gave the order to move ahead, the immense paddle wheels swinging round to rest no more till we was off the island of Madeira. Now we have a little rhyming couplet from Will. Far o'er the land, Far o'er the sea, land of my birth, I am wandering from thee. The passage down Southampton water is exceedingly beautiful. Indeed, I have never seen another spot in England to compare with it. The village of Hythe on the opposite side of the water is a very pretty spot, while on the opposite side, Netley Abbey, which is a ruin really, claims attention, environed by beautiful woody scenery and forming a peculiarly charming feature in the landscape. Then Hurst Castle, commanding the entrance of the Solent, the Isle of Wight is now before us, but unfortunately the evening is closing so fast around us that we can barely distinguish the towns of Ryde and Cowes. But the hour of 7 has arrived, and we are abreast the Needle Rocks and the Lizard Light. The engines are eased, and the pilot leaves us. We are now fairly on our way, with the wide Atlantic before us. And now another little bit of poetry. The shades of evening close around us, deeper rolls the ocean's swell, the stars shine bright above around us. Dear old England, fare thee well. As if by mutual consent, all hands paced the decks in silence and watching the receding lights. The land, on account of the darkness being no longer visible, we are all well aware that tomorrow the shores of England will no longer be in sight. At 9 p.m. we met a large steamer supposed to be the Tay, bound to Southampton, with mails from Mexico and the Havana. October 3rd. The morning broke thick and hazy, the wind also blowing pretty fresh from the westward, and therefore dead against us. And as there is nothing to be seen upon deck, I have ensconced myself and a portable desk behind one of the tables of the saloon, where a good fire is burning in the grate, and both looks and feels very comfortable. And as I have nothing else particular to engage my attention, I will endeavour to give some description of the noble vessel of which I am to be an inhabitant for some time. The Forth is considered to be the largest and best of the Royal Mail Company's ships. She was built at Leith, and her engines are by Berry of Liverpool, and of 450 horsepower. The engines are strong, firm, and exceedingly well fitted up and provided with excellent boilers. These ships are fitted up very different from the general plan of sea-going steamers. They are constructed to carry about 75 passengers and their servants, each passenger having a cabin entirely to his own use, and perfectly separate and independent of each other. The one which I occupy is 7 feet square, and contains my bed, which allows a large trunk to be placed under it, a chest of drawers, washstand, looking-glass, pins for hanging coats, cloaks, hats, etc. upon, and sufficient room for my portmanteau, carpet-bag, etc. The dining saloon is handsomely but plainly fitted up, everything proper for use and comfort, and no needless ornament. The ladies' cabin is situated at the stern of the ship, and on the main deck, as its name implies, is devoted to their exclusive use. You have excellent beds, clean sheets once a week, and 2 clean towels per day, and plenty of water, etc. The greatest attention to the comfort of the passengers is paid both by the captain and the servants in every respect. The saloon contains a well-stocked library, chess and backgammon boards, maps, charts, and various other methods of amusement. There are also plenty of chairs, benches, and camp stools on the spar deck. These vessels have 3 decks, the lower deck on which is the saloon and the lower tier of bed cabins, the main deck, which contains another tier of bed cabins, ladies' cabins, officers' and servants' mess rooms, and the spar or upper deck, which presents on both sides a clear promenade of 80 paces in length. The cuisine is first-rate, both upon the English and French system. Breakfast at 8:30, lunch at 12, dinner at 4, and tea at 7:30. To breakfast, beefsteaks, mutton chops, boiled eggs, omelettes, curry, cold meat and fowls, and excellent tea and coffee. To lunch, chiefly cold meat and baked potatoes, roasted apples, etc. The dinner consisted of every delicacy that it was possible to procure on board a ship, after which followed an excellent dessert. In the evening, tea or coffee, with plain bread and butter. The crew consists of the captain, who holds a lieutenant's commission in the Navy, 1st, 2nd and 3rd officers, 2 midshipmen, quartermaster, boatswain, and about 60 seamen. The engines department consists of 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th engineers, an apprentice, boiler-maker, and 24 stokers or firemen. Then there is the surgeon, purser, steward and stewardess, 6 waiters, a cook, scullery man, butcher and boots, which I think is somewhere about the muster roll. Right, I thought I'd stop at this point just to discuss some of the things that William's been talking about. Firstly, it's quite exciting that he's starting this whole new journey, as he says, on account of an engagement made with the Anglo-Mexican Mint Company. So this is less than 12 months after he gets back from Europe. So he begins his journey, unlike last time when he began his trip to Europe, having to get a horse and carriage from London to Dover. This time he can actually get the railway from London to Southampton. So we can see, just in those few years how much travelling must have changed. And then he gets to Southampton harbour or dock or whatever you want to call it. And it happened to be just at the time when this real passenger service was beginning to take off with steam-powered paddle steamers that had been designed to cross the Atlantic. And in fact, there's a pier in Southampton docks that's still just about there. I'll explain in a little bit why I say that. Called Victoria Pier, and that had been built in 1833 to accommodate these larger steam vessels and paddle steamers that were beginning to take passengers across the Atlantic. In fact, they built one in 1833, and then because of a little critter called a gribble worm, which gnawed away at the piles, they had to rebuild it again, and this time with, I think it says, with copper nails bashed into it to prevent these little gribble worms gnawing away at the wood. Anyway, the reason I say the pier is still there, there was a fire, I think, in 1987 that pretty well destroyed most of it, and there's still just, if you like, the bare bones of the platform there. But the grand gatehouse entrance is still there, and it's a listed building, quite grand, 2-towered affair that's apparently a sort of restaurant at the moment. But yeah, it's had a pretty checkered past. And of course, like a lot of these piers, once they suffer severe damage, like Brighton Pier and the pier here in Herne Bay, once they get damaged, people talk about them being rebuilt, but it doesn't look like it will ever happen. And that seems to be the case with the Victoria Pier in Southampton. But that's what William probably would have got onto his steamship, the Forth, before he started his journey. I thought I'd do a little bit about investigating this ship that he's on, the Forth, that he talks about. And as he mentions, it was built in Leith. It was launched in 1841, and it was owned by the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, who sort of, by acquisition, also became the White Star Line, or the White Star Line was part of the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, which owned the Titanic many, many years later. But at this time, the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company had been started by a Scotsman called John McQueen, and it was founded with very noble principles, really. This John McQueen believed that trade and commerce would lead to a great future for the nation. So I think its motto was everywhere by sea, and the line had been set up for the good of the nation, as it were. Whether in reality that was the case, I'm not sure, because later on it became embroiled in, sounds like sort of fraud and things like that. But quite an interesting thing, it was deliberately intended to offer passengers quite a high class, if they were of that class and they were paying that money, quite a high class level of comfort. Now, this is all relative, of course. A wooden paddle steaming ship in those days would certainly not be like a cruise liner today, with swimming pools and air conditioning and huge restaurants and things like that. It was still pretty basic, but actually how William describes it sounds quite nice. And I think this is actually a bit of a contradiction to some of the stuff that I researched, because people assume that it was awful on board for the early passengers. Obviously, it does depend on how much money you paid and, whether you were steerage or whether you were kind of in one of the more aristocratic areas of the ship. And William mentions that this ship could take 75 passengers plus servants and crew. But as he describes it, it sounds all very nice and civilised. He's a nice little cabin, and he's got a stateroom where he can, sit by the fire. And then the description of the food is very extensive. And that was another thing that I found very interesting. The long list of food that was required to victual this ship, as they say, It talks about 50 sheep and the little cow, the Ayrshire cow that had done 3 journeys across the Atlantic. Of course, the reason they had to put so much food on board and livestock was because they didn't have a refrigeration. So they had to have real animals, unfortunately, to slaughter. Even then, though, it must have been quite a strange thing. You've got a mixture on board of the steam engines creating a lot of smoke and dust and coal dust. And you've got butchering going on of animals. You've got the constant paddle steamer thud going on as well. I don't know whether it be luxurious or not, but anyway, how Williams describes it certainly sounds quite nice. And he seems certainly quite comfortable. But he does talk about the ladies not enjoying the journey so much. And I suspect if you weren't used to a sea crossing, perhaps it was pretty bad. No wonder seasickness was quite prevalent. As William says, he was a seasoned traveller by this time, so perhaps his constitution could take it a bit better than first-time travellers. This era I do find very interesting. The introduction of steam power had a huge impact on passenger journeys across seas because all of a sudden they were faster and they could be a lot more reliable. But, they were still pretty dangerous as well. And a lot of these early steamships founder. And in fact, I found a picture of the Forth, which is the ship that William was travelling on when it was being launched, and there was a little bit of history about it with this picture, because apparently when it was launched in Leith, 60,000 people came out to see it slip down the slipway, as it were, into the water. But it made the journey with the Royal Steam Packet Company several times across the Atlantic, mainly going to the West Indies and Mexico. In fact, William mentions other steamers, the Thames, I think, and the D, I think was another one, the Medway. They were called the West Indies mail steamers because also they'd been given this contract by the government to deliver mail to various destinations around the Caribbean and around Mexico as well. But the Forth itself, not many years after William had been on it, it foundered. It ran aground off Mexico, off the coast of Mexico, off Yucatan, on the Scorpion Reef. Luckily, I suppose it was close inshore, maybe the weather wasn't too bad. Apparently all the passengers and crew managed to get off safely and were rescued and no one perished. But it just goes to show that these journeys were still pretty perilous, even in the early age of steam. So, it's quite a brave thing for Will to do, to go all that far. I mean, it's one thing going across the channel in a steamship, but it's another thing entirely going across the whole of the Atlantic to get to Mexico. Obviously, they go via Madeira first and then across the Atlantic to Hispaniola and the West Indies and so forth. But yeah, I just thought it's a really interesting time at this point. To some extent, like the railways, steam was having this huge impact on passenger travel. And in fact, Thomas Cook, the travel agents, began its business around about this time. This was definitely a time, certainly, when travel, not just for business reasons, really, which is why William's doing it, but for leisure reasons and holiday reasons, began to take off. And often these excursions took place in these paddle steamers. And it's also the origins of companies like P&O as well. Personally, I find it a fascinating time. And I've really enjoyed William's description of his time on the ship and everyone there. And as I say, just that description of all the food sounds remarkable. It sounds like a sort of 4-star floating hotel. I'm sure it really wasn't quite like that, but there we are. They were made of tougher stuff in those days, so they didn't care if they didn't have air conditioning or plush bathrooms. And to some extent, I'm sure they had to make their own entertainment. I have read somewhere that the passengers, to pass the time, would have a bit of a sing-along and all that sort of thing. And, they weren't... there weren't any troops of dancing girls laid on for them or middle-of-the-road ballad singers warbling away at some starlit ballroom somewhere in the bowels of the paddle steamer. I mean, there wasn't room for a start, but it sounds like it was pretty tight, what with having to make room for the engines and the crew quarters and everything else. Apparently, I haven't read it, but Charles Dickens travelled about a similar time to this to America in a paddle steamer, didn't particularly like it and actually preferred going back on a sailing ship. As I observed previously, the morning was thick and squally. Not many of the passengers had made their appearance at breakfast. A few more mustered up the courage to appear at the dinner table, but still nothing like the complement of passengers we had. As for my own part, I was in most excellent appetite and feeling much better than I had done for some time previous. October 4th. Weather more moderate than we had it yesterday. A rather better muster at the breakfast and dinner tables, but none of the ladies have yet made their appearance. October 8th. Being Sunday, the captain read prayers up on deck. This morning the crew being all mustered in their best clothes and clean washed and shaved. Had no fire in the saloon since the second day after leaving. Weather beautifully fine and warm, and no wind found in the Bay of Biscay. Very calm. All the passengers have now made their appearance, ladies included, though some of them looking considerably worse for the visitation they had undergone. No doubt he means seasickness, I think. October 9th. So we get here another one of William's bits of poetry. On the vessel flies, the land is gone. The winds were calm in Biscay's sleepless bay. 6 days have spared, but with the 7th anon, new shores desired make every bosom gay. Madeira's mountains greet us on our way, the vessel dashing onwards through the deep. The usual monthly visit bent to pay, and soon on board the boatmen gaily leap. The land which we discovered about noon on this day was the island of Porto Santo. It is about 10 miles in length and about 25 in circumference. In 1518, a Portuguese ship coasting along the African shore was driven out to sea by a sudden squall, and when they all expected to perish, they discovered this island, which on account of their unexpected escape they named Porto Santo, or Holy Island, and from hence they discovered the island of Madeira. It produces a little corn, but there are oxen and wild hogs, and vast numbers of rabbits. Its most valuable productions are dragon's blood. So, dragon's blood apparently is a plant resin that was used for many applications, from medicine to varnish. Its most valuable productions are dragon's blood, honey and wax. There are also some quarries of excellent free stone, great quantities of which have been exported to Madeira. There is no harbour, but excellent anchorages in the road. There is only one town on the island, and that is called by the same name, the houses of which appear to be tolerably well built. Longitude 16 degrees 25 west, latitude 32 degrees 58 north. Long before we had passed this island, we could discover the lofty mountains of Madeira rising out of the blue waves of the Atlantic. This is a large and fertile island situated off the western coast of Africa. It was first taken possession of by the Portuguese, Don Henry of Portugal, better known as Henry the Navigator, at the very commencement of that brilliant career of his discovery, which terminated in the discovery of Africa and the passage to India by the Cape of Good Hope. During this voyage he learned of the existence of Madeira. The first landing was made in 1419, and in 1431 he sent Tristan Tzora and Gonzalo Zarco I think I'll have to get that pronunciation done properly. Tristo Vaz Teixeira and John Goncalves Zarco. He sent them with a colony to take possession of the island. They divided it into 2 districts, Machico and Funchal, and began to bring it into a state of cultivation. Its progress, however, is said to have been seriously retarded by a great fire which was kindled among the forest with which the island was covered, and which continued to rage for over 6 years, laying waste repeatedly the habitations which the colonists had erected. When, however, it was last extinguished, the ashes had so far increased the fertility of the soil that its produce soon became valuable. The first staple was sugar, in which Madeira was for some time unrivalled, but after it was cultivated on so great a scale in the West Indies, it ceased to be equally profitable, and the colonists there betook themselves to the production of wine, which became more and more lucrative in consequence of the increasing demand for it in Britain and her colonies, and it is now the object of a very extensive trade. The commerce of Madeira has long been considered of importance to this country, and in 1801, when it was apprehended that France might attempt to seize upon it, possession of it was taken temporarily by a British squadron. but was restored at the Peace of Amiens. In 1807, however, when the Portuguese government was compelled to emigrate to Brazil, Britain again held the island in trust for her ally. Madeira materially assisted Dom Pedro in his struggle with Miguel. Funchal is the capital of the island and is situated on the gentle ascent of some hills round a beautiful bay and built in the form of an amphitheatre. An old castle which commands the road stands on the top of a steep black rock called Santiago and is entirely surrounded by the sea at high water. There are also 3 other forts and several batteries. These streets are narrow and have streams of water running through them. The houses are built of stone and very few of them possess glass windows. The rest are closed with lattices, but in a mild climate like that of Madeira, glass is little needed. The cathedral is a very splendid building, the beams, doors, fittings and roof being of fine cedar, a species of wood in which the island formerly abounded. The principal curiosity of Funchal is a chamber in the Franciscan convent, the walls and ceiling being entirely covered with human skulls and thigh bones, and said to be the relics of holy men who have died on the island. The island of Madeira is considered one of the finest climates and most healthy places in the world. From Funchal itself, situated at the water's edge, to the tops of its loftiest mountains, dwellings are to be seen, reminding the traveller strongly of the banks of the Rhine and Danube, or the lakes of Switzerland and Italy. Such being the case, the invalid can always find a temperature suited to his care, and the beautiful and romantic scenery of the island is highly calculated to soothe and solace the mind. But even here, with all its advantages, the monster Death is not to be scared from his victim, and in consequence vast numbers of the bones of our countrymen rest on this island, to which many have come in the vain hope of renovating the constitution, broken in many instances by their own folly and neglect. We lay off the island for about 4 hours, and to those who had only been a week at sea the sight of land was grateful, but more especially so when it was an island so celebrated and beautiful. The moon was at the full, the sea exceedingly calm, the lofty spires of the churches and the white buildings of the city tinged with a silvery light, the mansions and cottages peeping out from the dark foliage on the lofty mountain side, and the most balmy fragrance also was wafted by almost imperceptible breezes from the shore. All these leave an impression upon the mind that no time after can efface. And now more poetry from William. Cloudless the moon shone on that lovely night, and on each object shared her silver light. A balmy fragrance breathing from the shore, though felt but once, dwells with us evermore. Farewell, sweet isle, now haste we on our way, to visit busier scenes with life more gay, but none so lovely as this dear sweet spot, oft remembered, ne'er to be forgot. Population of Funchal, 11,000. Population of the island of Madeira, 150,000. Longitude 17 degrees 6 east, latitude 32 degrees 38 north. So I'm going to stop here and talk a little bit about Madeira, as it seems a good point at which to discuss it. Obviously, by William's time, it had become an important stopover point for many, many ships making the journey across the Atlantic. You know, it was convenient, and it also got ships down to a more southern part of the Atlantic where they could pick up the helpful trade winds as well. So obviously it had a long history of being a stop-off point for journeys across the Atlantic before William's time. There's evidence that the Vikings might have visited Madeira well before the Portuguese started settling there. It seems to be quite often that the Vikings always got somewhere first before anybody else. But anyway, a bit like North America, same with Madeira. But the Portuguese were really the first people to properly inhabit it. And actually the island that William mentions first and sees first is Porto Santo, which is the smaller sister island of Madeira. And that was where they first settled, or first discovered the island, and then they moved on to the nearer, bigger island of Madeira itself. Just in passing, William mentions that there are plenty of rabbits on the island of Porto Santo. Well, actually, it turned out the introduction of rabbits to the island of Porto Santo by the Portuguese, sort of accidentally, was an absolute disaster for the vegetation, because there were no small land mammals on the island before these rabbits came along, and basically they gnawed everything to destruction. Basically made a lot of the island barren. So it was a bad example of a foreign species being introduced into an island and having a devastating effect on its flora and fauna. But Madeira itself, I'll just very briefly and broadly talk about its history. Once the Portuguese had discovered it in the 1400s, early 1400s, and started to settle there, it became popular for many reasons, mainly because of its climate, which was very healthy for growing things. But initially it was a very wooded island, and as William mentions, he mentions this thing about these fires that raged for, I think, 7 years. Well, unfortunately, that's what the early settlers were doing to sort of clear some of the wooded vegetation. They set these fires alight, and apparently, they did burn for many, many years, which made it difficult to inhabit the islands. But anyway, in fact, I think quite recently, in 2016, there was a very bad forest fire in Madeira that lasted for about 10 days. Anyway, but back when the early settlers were trying to establish themselves here, they cleared a lot of the woodland, and after growing wheat, the next crop that they started to grow, and which became very lucrative and led to the early wealth of the islands, was sugarcane. And regrettably, although very different, the model of growing sugarcane became the model for growing it in other areas of the world, such as the West Indies and South America, where slavery was implemented. But that model of slavery began, unfortunately, in the Madeiran Islands, although it was very different. There weren't many slaves, and seems like they were treated much better than slaves in other parts of the world. I mean, slavery is slavery, isn't it? So, to say being treated better. But anyway, regrettably, that model of using slave labour to harvest the crops was something that started in Madeira, or Madeira was an early version of it. And in fact, Christopher Columbus had quite a few connections with Madeira because he was a sugarcane trader at one point early on in his career. So he knew a lot about Madeira and spent quite a few years there. And as we know, his spread of European ways and things into the Americas wasn't particularly helpful in the early days. Now, the other thing I kind of thought I'd talk about Madeira, mainly in a way for a slightly nostalgic reason, is that, of course, its probably most famous export is Madeira wine. And I say it's slightly nostalgic because I always remember when I was a kid, my mum would have a bottle of Madeira wine on the go. So whenever guests arrived, it was always an excuse to get out the old Madeira wine and have a bit of a tipple with whoever had walked in through the front door. And we used to go through it quite quickly, actually. And my mum would say to me,
"Go down and get us another bottle of Madeira from the cellar."
Yes, admittedly, we had a cellar. It was a very small one, but it was a cellar. So I would go down there as a kid, brush off this dusty bottle of Madeira wine and bring it back up to Mum to open up and indulge. Rarely giving me any of it. Anyway, I did a few years ago, again for nostalgic reasons, thought I'd buy some Madeira wine because it's not that easy to get hold of in the UK anymore. And I did thoroughly enjoy it, but funnily enough, it seemed sort of browner in colour than I remember it. I remember it as being a sort of reddish colour when I was a kid, but apparently it all depends slightly on the ageing and the year and the great variety of what sort of colour it turns out like. So I can't quite remember what particular brand of Madeira wine my mum used to drink. I can sort of vaguely remember the label, but of course that will have changed from all those years ago. But anyway, so yeah, Madeira wine, it pricked up my ears when I first heard it being mentioned. I mean, its history goes back very, very long because after the sugarcane plantations in Madeira declined because sugarcane could be grown more successfully in places like Brazil and the Caribbean, they started to grow vines and produce Madeira wine. But Madeira wine was particular in the way, and is particular in the way that it's aged. It's sort of by accident they discovered that when they exported some wine on a ship that went to sail to the Americas and then came back without it being unloaded, the extra time that it spent in the hold, in the barrels, in this sort of warm, musty environment of the ship had actually altered the flavour of it and made it rather nicer. And so these days, essentially, Madeira is a fortified wine, so it has a bit of sugar added to it to increase the alcohol content a little bit. But it also is aged in a particular way with a little bit of heat, and sometimes the sun is used as well to give it these certain characteristics that make it Madeira wine. And it was very, very popular with the British early on. In fact, Shakespeare mentions Madeira wine in Henry IV, Part 1, apparently, when Falstaff is meant to have enjoyed a glass of it and is quoted as drinking it. And it became very popular with British winemakers and traders. So many of the early wine traders in Madeira were actually people from Britain who moved out there to be involved in the wine trade and the Madeira trade. And this also, I think, to some degree, is also why Portugal and Britain have had a very long connection of being allies going back many, many years. In fact, I think Portugal's often called Britain's oldest ally. But it was very popular, particularly in America, where at one time apparently 95% of the Madeira produced was consumed in America. And it's even said to have been the drink they drank at the Declaration of Independence. When they toasted the Declaration, they all had a glass of Madeira. And George Washington and Jefferson and all those people were meant to be fans of Madeira wine. So its presence and importance as a drink is very historic. And amazingly, the other thing about its properties is it can keep an extremely long time. It's not, even now, it's not unusual to find bottles of 100-year-old Madeira that once they're opened are still fine. And in fact, Madeira wine, if you open it now, apparently it will stay fresh for many, many years, even if the bottle's been opened and uncorked. So, as you can understand, that was probably why it was also very popular when it was being exported around the world, because it kept well during long sea voyages and journeys. But I must admit, when I drank it again recently, or fairly recently, I did enjoy it, but for something that was at one time seemed to be so popular a drink in the UK, these days it does seem quite hard to get hold of. Even if you go into a wine merchant, they seem to only have one bottle of Madeira. But it's still produced in very large quantities and in very, very many different styles, types, colours, ages, 5-year reserves, 10-year reserves, 20-year reserves, and so forth. So, yes, all this talk of Madeira wine is making me think I must purchase some again and sup from the varieties found in Madeira. One thing that slightly surprised me when William mentions it is that his ship, the Forth, only spends 4 hours anchored off the shore of Madeira. I suppose smaller boats came out with some provisions for them, but it may well be that Madeira's harbour then, which is in the capital of Madeira, which is Funchal, perhaps it was so busy with ships that they couldn't actually get into the harbour, so they probably had to just anchor off it. I don't know. But he doesn't actually ever step foot on the island itself, but he decides to talk about it rather a lot. As he says, it was probably a welcome sight for those who hadn't been at sea much before and had been there for a week at sea and finally saw land, even if they didn't get a chance to get on it. So there we are. I think I'm off to hunt down a bottle of Madeira for myself. Right, that's the end of this episode of A Grand Tour with my Great Great Grandad. First in this new series, covering his trip out to Mexico. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it. For me, it's always exciting when the journey begins, and especially when you get these sort of insights into what travel was like on a very, very early paddle steamer in those days. As I mentioned, these were still relatively hazardous journeys, so William seems to put a lot of faith in steam power. I suppose being an engineer he would do. It was his job after all, so I suppose he would sing its praises. He often refers to it as man's mightiest agent, We haven't covered a huge amount of ground in that episode, but there was plenty to talk about. So he's got to Madeira, and that seemed a good place to finish it before he goes on to his next stopping point, which is Barbados. That'll be the next island that he encounters as he journeys across from the UK across the Atlantic. In a way, I suppose it seems quite sensible, the route they used to take in these days. Not only did you get the help of the trade winds, because these paddle steamers still had extensive amounts of sail on them as well. So, if they could get the benefit of the wind and the paddle steamer power combined, obviously that made a huge difference. But also these journeys did give them these various stop-off points that they could get to. I suppose perhaps if they were travelling to somewhere like New York, this time they would have probably taken a bit of a more direct route. But anyway, it seems sensible to have these stop-off points. And I suppose they also had to recoal the engines as well, so that would have been another reason for creating these various points along the journey. So the next episode, basically, it's going to continue in this vein with William on the paddle steamer. It seems like there was still quite a regular routine on board of having prayers and things like that each day, and breakfasting and lunch and everything. I suppose they thought that was a good way to help pass the time. I suppose there's not much else to look forward to. I mean, it's still quite slow travel from Madeira to Barbados. It takes 24 days, so that's really quite slow. I suppose I could work out what the average speed through the water of these paddle steamers was, but it's not particularly great looking at the time it took for them to get from Madeira to Barbados. Although, of course, that's the first of the Caribbean islands, so the rest are a lot closer than that. I imagine that was the longest part of the journey from location to location, taking that long. Anyway, that is it. As I say, just to quickly recap, if you want to get in touch, I'll give all the social media ways you can. There's the Blue Sky account, which I mentioned, Ed Hill, and that's at scotsgrandtour.bsky.social. There's a Twitter page still going, that's at 3G Grand Tour, and that's Scott of the Historic. There's the Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my Great Great Grandad. There's an Instagram account, Ed's 3G Tour, that's number 3, G Tour, and that's double D, so it's EDDS, 3G Tour. And Edward Hill, that one. There is actually a Reddit forum as well, which is r/Grand Tour with WS, if you want to dig that out and join it. It's not exactly booming with members at the moment, but I set it up because I thought it'd be quite a nice way to have more of a debate about things in terms of the history that's talked about, and history more in general of that period. Is linked to the podcast, but not solely about that. So if you want to get involved, do look that one up as well. So on to Barbados with William. He's travelling on his own at this point, I should say. He's not got his family with him. Rather like when he went out to Europe, he travels out to the destination first on his own. Unlike Europe, it's much, much longer before his family join him. I think it's about 2 years, certainly 18 months to 2 years, I think, before they join him again. So it's a much, much longer period where he's on his own in Mexico. So, finally, if you have been, thanks for listening.